Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Ridhwana Khan, and I'm excited to talk to you about demystifying some of the magic behind Rails. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm a lead software engineer. I'm a technical writer for the official Ruby on Rails guides, and I'm a community builder. But most importantly, I'm a cat mom to these two goofballs. This is Zeus, least attractive photo I have, and this is Zoe. Zoe sometimes helps me write the technical Ruby on Rails guides, but she's always distracted by bird videos in the background, and she makes so many typos. So if you're reviewing any of those documentation PRs and you come across typos, you know who to blame, not me. So good documentation is crucial. It's the primary source of truth for developers. Rails is known to be well documented, but there's always room for improvement, and that's where the technical writing team comes in. The Rails Foundation has assembled a team to thoroughly review the documentation, filling in gaps, making sure that the content is up to date, and writing clear and accessible documentation for developers at all levels. It's a three-step process. We audit the entire Rails documentation and the open issues that are labeled docs to identify whether there is missing or outdated content. The sections are assigned to writers, and once the internal PRs are opened, at least 3 other team members review that PR. After reviewing it, we polish it, and thereafter we create a PR on the Rails repo. It's marked RF Docs, and it has a label Rails Foundation. And that's where you come in. It's open for a week for community review. To write accurate and helpful documentation, I often dive into the Rails source code to understand how the underlying components work. Hence, I'll start off this presentation by using my experiences to share some of the strategies and patterns that I've found useful when navigating the Rails source code. Next, we'll dive into 3 examples in the Rails code base that is used to dynamically generate methods. We'll talk through meta-programming techniques like method missing, class eval, instance eval, send, and others. And we'll explain how these methods work together to create powerful and dynamic behavior in Rails. We'll also review the benefits and drawbacks of using meta-programming in Rails, highlighting how these techniques are used to impact the framework. Finally, I'll briefly talk through use cases and how we've used these patterns in a recent project. By the end, you'll have tools to trace through the code, recognize patterns, and hopefully demystify some of that magic behind Rails. So, the Rails code base can be really overwhelming at first. However, with the right approach, it becomes more manageable. In this section, we'll explore strategies to make navigating the source code a little bit less intimidating. When I'm diving into a new area of the code base, I'd like to approach it systematically. I start first by consulting the Rails guides. It is invaluable for understanding what a component does and how it is used. For example, if you're curious about the belongs to association, the Rails guides provide detailed explanation of its usage and its behavior. The API docs, however, point you to specific methods and classes involved, as well as the source location of these methods within the Rails code base. It's important to understand a method's intended behavior before trying to decipher its implementation. For broader understanding, I also read the READMEs of each component. These files offer an overview of the purpose as well as the integration within the framework. For example, a README for active model provides insights into how the library facilitates object models without needing a database. I mentioned that you can find the source location in the API. However, you can also leverage Ruby's source location method to find where that method is defined. For example, if you're trying to figure out where the find-by method is implemented in the Rails console, you can run something like user.method. You can pass it the method you're trying to find. In this case, it's find-by, and then you call source location on it. It will give you back the file path as well as the line number, which is really useful in order to be able to trace through the code. You can open the file and you can further examine how Rails handles this dynamic query generation. It's important to pay attention to recurring patterns and conventions in the Rails code base. There's a meta-programming technique called define method, which is used to create methods based on certain conditions. If you search for define method in the Rails code base, it appears 260 times across 110 files. This frequency highlights how foundational it is to the Rails code base, making it crucial for you to understand in order to be able to navigate the Rails source code effectively. Recognizing these patterns can help you to understand similar occurrences in other parts of the code base. You can also use the command bundle open to view a specific component within your editor. This, combined with something like the debug gem, will then allow you to set breakpoints to be able to trace through the code and inspect variables using a debugger. Rails is also known for its robust testing suite. Reviewing tests can reveal expected behavior as well as help you to understand the use cases as well as the edge cases. For instance, one of the challenges when working with meta-programming like define method is ensuring that you correctly understand what's happening, because meta-programming can mean that method definitions are often abstracted away. Here's an example of a spec that confirms the dynamic generation of validation methods, and this was implemented using define method in the source code. These tests ensure that the appropriate validation methods are generated based on the different types of associations. And by reading through these tests, you are able to better understand the underlying code. Take advantage of AI tools like GitHub Copilot to assist in code exploration. For instance, if you're working in a model file and you're unsure about how the validation in that method works, Copilot may be able to explain to you the relevant code to you and point you in the right direction. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't critically review the suggestions that Copilot gives you and make sure that it aligns with the understanding with your own research. By combining these techniques, however, Rails will become less of a mystery, making it easier to debug, develop, and deepen your understanding of the framework. To understand the Rails source code, one should aim to be familiar with Ruby meta-programming because Rails uses so much of it. Meta-programming allows a program to write or modify its own code. By operating at runtime, that is, when a program is actively running, meta-programming makes the Rails source code more flexible and adaptable to different situations without needing to change the underlying code base. There are numerous meta-programming techniques and patterns embedded within the Rails framework. In this section, I'll guide you through the examples in the Rails source code that use these patterns, illustrating how they've played a role in the Rails framework that we know and love today. This is example 1, and it's an excellent example of how method missing and other meta-programming techniques are used in Rails. This module is critical for handling MIME types in controllers, and it manages the collection and organization of different response formats for a given controller action. When you use respond to in a controller, it matches the requested MIME type and then executes the corresponding block of code. Consider the articles controller. In this articles controller, we have a show action, and it retrieves a single article. Depending on the accept header of this GET request on the top right, which indicates the content type that the client is able to understand, we then respond with the relevant MIME type. In all cases, the collector module is responsible for determining the appropriate response format. Now, this is a ton of code on the screen. But we're going to go through the important bits, the ones that are dynamic in nature, just slightly intimidating looking, and occur in patterns across the entire code base. These are the two important bits: generate method for MIME and method missing. An example that we'll use to trace through the code in this section is a GET request, which you can see on the top left corner of the slide, to an article show method requesting JSON. You can find it at well, depending on which way you're looking, but in your way, it will be the top right corner of every slide. When a client requests an article in JSON format, then the responsive block in the controller tries to find a method named JSON. Since JSON is not explicitly defined, method missing in the collector module is now triggered. What is method missing? Method missing handles calls to methods that are not explicitly defined in the code base, thus enabling dynamic method creation. When method missing is executed here, it is passed a parameter symbol, which in this case is the MIME type format, JSON. Since JSON is a registered MIME type, it eventually calls a method with the name generate method for MIME. Using our example again, this gets passed JSON. The method generate method for MIME dynamically generates instance methods for the given MIME type. It uses class eval to dynamically define a method after the symbolized MIME type. Class eval allows you to evaluate a block of code within the context of a specific class or a module. You can modify or extend a class's functionality without altering the class's original source code. So this dynamically created method defined by class eval is named after the MIME type symbol, JSON in our case. The method takes a variable number of arguments, and inside it calls another method, custom, with a method named custom and a MIME type lookup argument, MIME JSON in our case. Once this method is defined, we go back to the method missing, and then we trigger public send. Public send is used to invoke public methods dynamically by their name at runtime. When public send is called with the parameter JSON, we're calling the method JSON, and inside JSON we have a custom method. We pass through the custom method with the parameter MIME, with the MIME type JSON parameter. I encourage you to trace through the custom method on your own. It handles the processing of the request based on the MIME type, as well as the given parameters. Thus, it results in a response hash that would look something like that. Hence, when a request is made to the show action of the article's controller, Rails will check the accept header of the request to determine the desired response format. If the response format is JSON, Rails will look up the MIME JSON in the response hash that it created. It will then find the proc object and execute it, rendering the article as JSON. By combining method missing, class eval, and public send, Rails can dynamically define and invoke methods based on the requested MIME type, making the controller's response handling flexible and efficient. In our next example, we'll talk through building associations. Recently, when I was writing the active record associations documentation, I updated a section about the API methods for an association. For instance, when you declare a belong to association for any, when you declare a belongs to association or any other association for that matter, Rails will give the declaring class numerous methods related to that association. So for example, when you're defining a post class and it has a relationship belongs to author, where a post belongs to an author, you can use those generated methods for dynamic query and retrieval of the association. So these are some of the methods that you'll see. You can get an author, which is the association, using post.author. You can set it using post.author equals to author. There are other numerous generated methods like build author, creating it, reloading, resetting, and tracking changes on the association, the author method. Similarly, since we know that these methods cannot be hard-coded, it led me to explore how Rails dynamically generates these methods for a class. So the relevant methods are defined in this module, Active Record Association Builder, and the class is the association, and we're going to go through the build methods. The way that I found this code is I used that trick that I showed earlier, the source location, and that led me to this particular method. It's evident that the Rails source code has put a lot of effort into naming things very clearly. So just by looking at this code and reading through it, you can see that we check for a name conflict, then we create a reflection, then we define methods like the accesses, the callbacks, the validations, the tracking methods, and finally, we return a reflection. I've said reflection a lot, so what is a reflection? A reflection in Rails represents metadata about an association between two active record models. It contains details such as the association class, the type, and other options like the foreign key constraints. For example, when you define an association like this one, where a post belongs to an author and it has many comments, then Rails creates reflection objects for the associations belongs to and has many. This allows Rails to understand how a post model relates to an author model and how it relates to the comments model, thus allowing us to enable features like eager loading, validations, etc. The active record reflection module provides methods to access these reflection objects. For example, you can retrieve the reflection in an association using this method, reflect on association, and pass it to your association. Now we're able to see what type of macro it is, what the class name of the reflection is, etc. Going back to our original code in the association class, over here, we create the reflection. Now that we know what a reflection is, we know that it is going to encapsulate metadata about the association. It is a really fruitful side quest to go through the create reflection method on your own and to explore the active record reflection module. But for the purposes of this section, I'm going to focus on the define accesses definition. So define accesses method is responsible for creating getter and setter methods for associations. So remember when we talked about post.author or post.author equals to the author value, those are your getters and setters. The method defines a mixin variable and it uses model.generated association methods, which if we had to peek into the active record core module, we'd see that this method returns a dynamic module. In the case of our post example, this module would look something like this. So post-generated association methods. This module is dynamically created when a post model is loaded. It is responsible for storing instance methods for associations like comments, authors, and that must be defined on the model. In her talk, The Magic of Rails, at Rails World 2023, Eileen Uschitel described this behavior and highlighted the magic of active record and associations comes from methods, classes, and modules that are dynamically generated when your application boots and when your models are loaded. Once the dynamic module in this code is returned, we then define the readers and the writers, and we pass through that dynamic module. And then we also pass through the association name. So this is what the define readers and the define writers methods look like. Let's discuss the reader method first. This method is used to dynamically create reader methods for associations in this dynamic module. For a post module, define readers will define a method with the association name author, and then it looks up the author association in the association cache and calls reader on it. With the defined writers, we do the same thing. So in our example, it will define a method, author equals to, and in the post class, it then writes the author association for the association author object. This dynamic method definition approach mirrors the pattern that we've seen in the previous example with the MIME types, right? So class eval there was used to add instance methods dynamically, and it was used to create a JSON method. In this example, however, it facilitates adding these methods to that dynamic module post-generate association method, and then to create these association objects. We also use this approach to define the additional generated methods that I talked about right at the start. So in terms of reflection changed, so author changed and then author previously changed, you can see it uses a similar pattern. Similarly, for reload author, reset author, they're all using class eval and defining dynamic methods. The same for build author, and create author with a bang. These are all the same patterns, and once you understand how one part of the code base works, it's easy to apply those techniques to other part of the code base and try to understand how that works. Our final example in this section is to define autosave validation, define the autosave validation callbacks module. It's such a mouthful. It handles the automatic validation and saving of associated records when their parent is saved. So consider, once again, a post model that belongs to an author. When you save a post instance, Rails will eventually call a method named define autosave validation callbacks. It dynamically creates a method. This method, define autosave validation callbacks, will dynamically create a method that will validate the associated records for an author, for a post. So it is called during the validation phase of the post model to ensure that all the author records are valid, thus ensuring data consistency and ensuring that we don't try and save invalid associations in our database. So let's explore the important bits of define autosave validation callbacks. The parameters that are sent through is a reflection, and we know what a reflection is now. It's just metadata about an association. In this case, it's a belongs to reflection based on the fact that a post belongs to an author. Now, this method does a few things, which most of you will be able to trace through on your own. The part that we'll talk through is where the magic lies, the define non-cyclic method over here. When we dive into this method, you will realize that the validation method parameter represents the name of the method that will be defined in define non-cyclic method. It's defined dynamically. However, the validation name is defined for this method is defined a few lines up. Validate associated records for the reflection, which is author. And then the block passed into define non-cyclic method, in this case, is a send method, and then it passes through the method, which again is defined a few lines up. Validate belongs to association, and again, we pass through the reflection belongs to reflection. As a refresher, the send method is a metaprogramming technique that allows you to call private or public methods dynamically by name. So let's go through the define non-cyclic methods to see how the validation method works, as well as how that block we sent in impacts the code. If a method with the name validated associated records for author is not defined already, then we define it dynamically. Define methods offers a way to create methods at runtime based on the specific conditions or inputs. This method definition is key to allowing active record to handle various types of associations without the need of countless predefined methods. This newly defined dynamic method, validate associated records for author, is also used to prevent cyclic dependencies by ensuring that each validation process only runs once per method call. Once a validation method has been called, it will not be called again, thus preventing infinite loops. A crucial part of how this is done is this line of code, result equals to instance eval passing through the block, which gets assigned only if the validate associated records for author has not been called before. In Ruby, instance eval allows you to evaluate a block of code or a string within the context of a specific object, thus granting you access to that object's private methods and instance variables. This allows you to dynamically extend or manipulate an object behavior without altering the public interface directly. So the result is obtained by evaluating the block with instance eval. Now, the block of code that we had is actually the send method, which calls the validate belongs to association method while passing in the reflection. By using instance eval, we ensure that the validate belongs to association method has access to its private methods and instance variables and can operate as if it were defined directly on that instance. Hence, going back to our original method in define autosave validation callbacks, this line, validate validation method, helps Rails to dynamically register the dynamically defined validation method that we just talked about, which is validate associated records for author, that in turn will call validate belongs to association because that was in our send block. And validate belongs to association will then go on and it will validate all the association records. This process and the patterns that were used ensures that Rails properly registers the dynamic validation method and performs necessary checks to validate the association record before saving the post, thus ensuring data integrity in the application. So now that we've gone through some examples, let's talk about some of the benefits and drawbacks of using metaprogramming. Metaprogramming allows Rails to automatically generate code and behavior to create conventions for methods, associations, and validations dynamically, reducing the need for boilerplate code and configuration. That's what we love about Rails. Rails applications often need to handle a variety of use cases, making our lives as users of the framework better. Metaprogramming techniques provides the flexibility to define and modify methods, classes, and behaviors, making the framework extensible and flexible. Metaprogramming also helps to simplify the design of the Rails API by allowing the framework to provide a more intuitive and expressive interface without exposing those complex underlying implementations. And finally, Rails leverages metaprogramming to adhere to the don't repeat yourself principle. By generating the repetitive code patterns dynamically, Rails is able to keep the code base clean and reduce redundancy. However, with all these benefits, there also comes just a few drawbacks. Metaprogramming can add layers of abstraction. You've seen the code. And it makes the code less transparent. This can lead to difficulties in debugging features and understanding how the different parts of the code interact. The dynamic nature of metaprogramming can also introduce performance overheads. Generating code on the fly and evaluating code at runtime may be slower compared to static code, potentially affecting performance of applications. And finally, code that heavily relies on metaprogramming might become harder to maintain. It may be harder to attract new contributors as they find the dynamic code intimidating. However, while there are challenges, Rails leverages metaprogramming in the most useful way for us to enforce strong conventions, to minimize configuration, and to introduce adaptability, which ultimately, in my opinion, improves the developer experience. Learning and applying metaprogramming from the Rails source code can greatly improve your ability to build dynamic and flexible systems, and there are numerous situations where it's beneficial. When I worked at a company called Forum, also known as Dev.2, which created community software, we used metaprogramming to create dynamic profile fields for different communities. So for instance, if there was a gardening community, we might need to ask users, what is your favorite plant? And that would be a profile field. Whereas for a developer community, you might want to ask users, are they available for hire? And that would be a profile field that is very relevant to only that community. So each of these dynamic fields could then have different data types like strings, booleans, etc. This is the code that lives on that open source repo, the Forum open source repo. I'm not going to go through it, but you can go and read through the code if you wish. It uses a combination of method missing, send, and class eval to be able to create dynamic profile fields. I hope that by exploring the Rails source code, it has inspired you to dive deeper into Rails. We've gone through examples, and we've seen how metaprogramming enhances Rails flexibility. As you continue to work with Rails, consider how these concepts can also be applied to your projects. By understanding the internal mechanics of Rails, it will help to resolve complex issues as well as open up new possibilities for enhancing your applications. if you have the time, I would strongly encourage you to engage with the Rails community, to review pull requests, whether they are active or whether you're reviewing them passively, and to contribute to the community as well. Because not only will it deepen your understanding of Rails, but it will also strengthen your connection with the Rails ecosystem. As I wrap up this talk, I'd like to thank Patrick DeHoche for reviewing this talk multiple times, as well as the Rails World team for this opportunity. But most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming today to join me. I look forward to chatting to some of you as the day progresses, and you can find me on X with username @Ridhwana K. Thank you so much.